I'm just going to ask you to welcome our beloved Chris Killam.
Cut it a couple minutes shorter? But don't say anything about it, okay? So I just want to know what, I mean, I speak all over the world. It's customary to be given water, but at what other conference would you be given hemp rain? Just in case you don't know where you are. Last weekend, my wife Zoe and I were at a Native American church ceremony in upstate New York, and so we got in a teepee. It was supposed to be like 30 people, but of course it turned out to be 42 people. So we were all really, really close, but at least we were really hot. But it was okay because it was airless and very smoky. And it wasn't so bad because we only had to sit in there upright for 12 hours. But anyway, so we, you know, I don't know who started this particular part of it, eating the ground dried peyote. I understand that certain things are kind of like trials by ordeal, but you get this handful of dried peyote in your mouth and you kind of hang out like this because you can't swallow it, and you have to wait for the tea to come. But anyway, we had a great night, and I think the important thing about it for me, because it's not really my tradition and it's not actually the ceremonies that, let's say, I gravitate to the most, but it was very refreshing. It was spiritually refreshing. I want to thank Theta, by the way, for that beautiful sound introduction. You know, I've spoken as a motivational speaker. I mean, I don't actually know who I motivate or what I motivate people to do, but I've spoken as a motivational speaker at some network marketing meetings, and they always start out with that horrible song, I Believe I Can Fly. Nothing you want to hear coming out of the mouth of somebody tripping on acid who's near an open window. No, you cannot actually fly, man. They just like back off. Come back to the couch. This marks the 50th year, actually, of my psychedelic excursions. I started out in boarding school. I think it was actually a late September in 1967 when I took a tab of white lightning. And I've mistakenly, by the way, been saying in talks for years that it was 100 micrograms of LSD. It was the first time I ever got high. And then I went back and actually looked into the history of white lightning, and it was actually 250 micrograms. Gee, no wonder it was so strong. So in any case, that was kind of a world-shattering experience for me, as it is for so many people who engage with psychedelics. It doesn't really matter whether it's LSD or it's the mushrooms or it's peyote or it's San Pedro or it's ayahuasca. It really has a lot to do with taste tolerance, frankly. You know, that's one thing I'll say in the peyote ceremony. People are going, oh God, this is awful. And I'm going, this is like candy, man. I drink ayahuasca. This is all right. But however we approach the psychedelics, and the word psychedelic, I think you all know this, coined by British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in 1957. It means mind expanding. And that has a kind of a dual meaning. Not only the individual consciousness, but also the way Buddha describes mind as the field from which all originates and into which all goes, and which is the all in everything, and of which we are completely part and inseparable. And it is that sense of being connected to all things and part of all things that is so delightful and intriguing and inspiring and genuinely refreshing about the psychedelics. And in case it has escaped your notice, there is a battle going on for your heart and soul. And this has been the case throughout history. This isn't a new thing. It's not just because we have an orange-haired maniac in the White House. It's because this battle has been going on forever. And there are sort of two groups of people. There are people who believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, sort of let's live and let live. I think there are a lot of those folks in this group here. And then there are a lot of people who spend an enormous amount of time and organization trying to figure out how to make everybody else do it their way, sort of dominator types. Some good examples of dominator types coming up against free thinkers on psychedelics can be found in those wonderful, wonderful US Army and British Marine and other videos from the 50s. In the US Army one where the Army cadets are given LSD and then they're made to march, at a certain point, they're just standing there like this. Because they can't believe how stupid it is. And then what happens is, to make it even better, at some point, the drill sergeant is given acid. Okay? So, and the commentator, the drill sergeant no longer seems to be capable of giving orders. It's all very, this is put out, by the way, at the beginning you get this like second and a half that this film was made by the U.S. Department of Chemical Warfare. Didn't work. Didn't work. They were hoping for an agent of conformity, something you could really use to manipulate people. So finally, this drill sergeant, he's pretty much out of his mind because he's peaking, okay? He's having a good time. He doesn't want to drill these guys. And they get some colonel or something, some big deal dude to come out, and he says, you should drill these soldiers, sergeant. And he says, you want them drilled? You drill them. Beautiful. So we have these agents of complete disruption. There are a lot of people out there, and you don't have to be a conspiracy nut. You just have to pay attention to history. There are a lot of people out there who want to cram isms, ologies, and osophies down our throats. They want us to look a certain way. They want us to be a certain color. They want us to behave sexually a certain way. And they only want us to use substances that have kind of familiar effects. Like, you know what's going to happen if you drink a lot, okay? You're going to get stupid, sing bad songs, and maybe throw up on the outside of your car. That's what's going to happen. But nobody knows what's going to happen when you take acid. Nobody knows what's going to happen when you drink ayahuasca. Maybe you'll be swallowed by an anaconda. Maybe you'll heal something. Anything goes. And this unpredictability, this disruptive nature, is very disturbing to people who try so hard to control others. One of the big disparities between the freedom lovers, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness group, which is sort of pretty much these people in this room here, and the guys in the dull gray suits, is that we don't spend a lot of time getting together, being organized. We just like have each other's company. We enjoy ourselves. We do what we do. We work, we live. And the other camp spends an enormous amount of time being organized about how to deal exactly with people like us. And so far, if you just kind of pay attention to history, even when you have things like the Crusades, even when you have awful, awful, awful things like Joseph Stalin and the Nazi Party, sooner or later those things go, and human freedoms continue to leak out in all directions because this is our nature. The psychedelics provide us with, I mean, for one thing, they provide us with a lot of fun. I don't want to suggest that this all has to be solemn. And in fact, a few weeks ago, a friend and I both drank really impressive, huge quantities of San Pedro cactus that I had very carefully made. And it's wonderful. If you know about San Pedro, it's like peyote, same concentration of mescaline in the dried product. Oddly, it's legal, so you can go to your garden stores. It's legal to buy it. It's legal to sell it. It's not legal to cook it and drink it. How weird is that? Like, you know, somebody's going to follow you home. We saw you buy that San Pedro at the garden center. Are you getting a pot ready on your stove? No, that's not what goes on. So you can just like go home and do this thing if you really want to. I'm not suggesting you do. I'm just saying you could if you want to. I was in a native ceremony in Vanuatu, South Pacific, and it was a firewalking ceremony, and this big chief, this amazing guy who I have great admiration for, we were watching a group of native men do a war dance that they had never ever done in public for 1,000 years. I mean, I don't mean these guys were specifically that old, but through generations. And Michel looked at me and he said, "You can dance if you want to." And I said, "Oh, thank you so much." And he said, "I said you can dance if you want to," which meant get in there and dance. So I got in there and danced and discovered this most remarkable thing, that in seconds of doing what they were doing, I was in this extraordinary trance. I was experiencing something in this group of sweaty native guys, all of whom, you could never work out in your life if all you did was Pilates and weights to be half as fit as these people, because all they do is physical work their whole lives. But there they were dancing, and I was in there dancing with them, and there was this trance. It was like, oh, okay, I get it. We have these methods, we have these materials, we have these things we can do, and there's a reason that governments and especially religions have worked so hard against this. These things cannot be controlled. When you take acid, well, when I took acid, a number of things happened, even at the tender age of 15, and I don't know whether it's good or bad for 15-year-olds to take LSD. I just know that for me it was sort of a solution to a problem. And the problem was social strictures that I didn't buy, that I thought were just completely cornball and useless. And the solution was the experience of the everything outside of those parenthetical boundaries. And gee, you know, nobody really told us about this. And my friends did that, and their friends did that. And then strangely, we had these ideas that we hadn't had before, like, well, maybe it's a good idea to learn yoga, right? I mean, that's possible. I've been practicing yoga every day for 47 years now as a result of that. And, oh, you know, who here's going to learn to cook right? I volunteered to learn how to cook the brown rice. Okay, because it was very vexing. You know, we were all used to Uncle Ben's, and an idiot, only an idiot could mess up Uncle Ben's, all right? But it's hard to get the brown rice thing figured out the first time, like, oh man, you know, I burned it solid. And, you know, we all decided that we should get involved with herbs and so many things. And then there was this whole sense that kind of came upon us, at least my friends and myself, that things natural were somehow better and more sustainable. This is in a time of Jell-O salads. I mean, Jell-O salads, like, who came up with Jell-O salads? We had this very, very weird dessert product called junket rennet custard. Who remembers junket? Okay, yeah. It was just this grotesque kind of slimy, like almost like if you could combine chocolate and mucus and then firm it up and serve it in a bowl. And that was junket rennet custard. My mom did commercials. Back then, commercials were live, TV commercials. And she did commercials for Hostess, you know, continental baking. So Hostess cupcakes, and of course Twinkies. Twinkies, the edible non-food. And so we had free Twinkies, including, I don't know, the rare Twinkies, the ones that had the strip of chocolate on the top that looked like a tongue depressor. Maybe you remember, they were out briefly, but anyway, we had those. It was a weird time. It was a time of experimental foods and TV dinners. But it was also a time when people were very, very early tinkering with the psychedelics. I mean, indigenous native people have been using the psychedelics for a long time, and they've been using them for healing, and they've been using for visionary purposes, and they've been using them to see into things in a most remarkable way. And we eventually, those who were not native people, came in contact with some of this use, and then there began this kind of strange dual interest. On the one hand, people who wanted to know more about these things, they want to know more about, well, what is this stuff you're blowing up into your sinuses through a bifurcated turkey thigh? That looks interesting, if a little painful. And on the other hand, people are saying, we must put a stop to this. We must make sure that instead they're doing their rosaries. Now, what's the crazy thing about this? What's the lure of the psychedelics? Okay, you all hear Ezekiel saw a wheel. Yeah, okay. I mean, I've seen the rise and fall of entire civilizations. You know, why are we beholden to singular visions that people had thousands of years ago when we can have them for ourselves right now? I come from a family of ministers. I have great respect for the community service that my grandparents and my uncle and my cousin and other people in the ministry have shown, you know, going to visit the sick and dealing with people who need help in a variety of ways. But I'm also thoroughly fed up with and have no use for the absolute and utter hypocrisy of and increasingly useless archaic nature of most of what the churches provide. Because there's this fundamental belief that you must have an intermediary. I mean, forget the pedophile thing that's like everywhere. I don't know how you could forget that. You know, nobody wants to be an altar boy anymore. No, thanks. You know, I'll just stay out here and sweep the floor. I don't need that honor. Thank you. And no, it's awful. It's just plain awful. And we've seen more wars and more strife and more murders and more bad things happen in the world due to opposing religious philosophies than almost anything else. And yet what happens when we consume the psychedelics, and not always when we consume the psychedelics, we have a direct experience of spirit. I was someplace in the middle of describing to you how my friend and I drank San Pedro, and I wound up on a track that took me off like to verbal Nebraska here. So just to finish up on that. So we drank this, you know, I get lost too. So we drank this stuff, and then we like laid out on mats in the sun on the deck, you know, for a while. And then after a while, it was like, well, to heck with this. Let's go take a walk in the woods and then go swim in the river. Because what happened was that without any sort of going through difficult things about whatever happened when we were 5 or something like that, we just simply arrived at a place that felt unified and whole and bright and wonderful and friendly and expansive and open, and there just plain wasn't any work to do. And that refreshment, which is one of the things I want to talk about, is such a big lure for us. Yeah, you can do way too much of anything. I mean, you can drop acid every day, and then that's not really a good habit. But, when you take the psychedelics and you remember to do so with a good mindset and in a right setting, what happens is they refresh us. They renew us. There's a sense of psychic and emotional and physical cleansing. Now, of course, with ayahuasca, there's more than just a sense of that. You puke your face off. That's very different. You know, it's not just, oh, like I'm having a sense of cleansing. No, it's like I'm running to the bathroom for my life. Okay. And there is, of course, how many of you have drunk ayahuasca? Okay, so you're all familiar with the toilet vortex? Many is the Joe Tafur up here. He knows, he's smiling. He's seen thousands of people go through this. He's a medical doctor and shaman. He's been there. He's seen the worst messes that can be made in bathrooms. So what happens is you drink ayahuasca, and you know the anaconda's charging down your throat, or jaguars are chasing you around in the night, or something, or you're just watching the wheels of time, or meeting Jesus, or whatever's happening to you. And then at a certain point, you have to get to the toilet. And the have to get to the toilet is not like, oh, you know, I think soon I'll probably need to get up to go to the bathroom. It's like, how fast can I run? And so you get into the bathroom, and you know, at most of these shamanic centers, these are not the bathrooms in the Four Seasons, okay? So it's not, nor are they like the bathrooms in Japan where they have those bewildering toilet seats that are electronic. Anybody here spend time in Japan? Okay, so when you go into a Japanese bathroom, it's almost terrifying because you're given a remote control for the toilet seat. Because it vibrates, it heats up to the temperature you want, and it has all these different things that squirt you in ways that are not entirely comfortable. Anyway, none of that exists in the toilet vortex in these ayahuasca centers. They're more primitive affairs. And there's the question that a lot of people have when they get in there: am I really on the toilet, or am I on my mat doing something very embarrassing in front of everybody? And things that are totally familiar to us become unfamiliar. Many's the person who repeatedly grips the toilet seat just to make sure it's there, okay? Or like gets to the sink and just falls apart because at that particular moment in time, it is just way too complex. And sometimes these people have to be dragged out. You have to come out of the toilet vortex. You must come back into the ceremony. And they, oh yes, man, please. So this happens too. So the cleansing may in fact be psychic and just sort of like light and friendly, as happens with San Pedro, or it may be you're dragging your intestines on the ground, as with ayahuasca. But this cleansing occurs, and we feel refreshed in a true way, often inspired. And this is marvelous. This does something for us extraordinary. It gives us the energy and the vitality and the focus to engage ourselves in ways that do something important. They make us happier. And I don't understand how anybody would want to prevent the happiness of others, provided they're not hurting people. But this is what's going on right now. And we live in a very interesting time in which, for the first time since many, many decades, we now see human clinical studies on the psychedelics. Now, many, many millions of people are engaging in, Native American peyote ceremonies and ayahuasca ceremonies, and doing more with LSD and with San Pedro. And it is, in some ways, and I don't want to exaggerate this, it is in some ways changing the culture in which we live. And it's also changing medicine. So you have the refreshment part of the program. God, we had a great day, we did acid, we were at the beach. There's nothing wrong with doing acid and going to the beach. I mean, provided, you don't set your hair on fire and do other weird things. But at the same time, there's a whole dimension of healing. And I've come to recognize what I like to refer to as mystic healing. And I want to explain that. We saw in the Johns Hopkins studies of people with terminal cancer who were given psilocybin and who, for the most part, lost their fear of dying and lost their anxiety about it. And furthermore, the majority of whom arrived at a place where they said, no, I'm no longer afraid of dying. I mean, I'd be happy to live longer, but now I understand my place in the universe, and I feel okay about my passage, and whatever happens next, I hope it's a good thing. What remarkable, compassionate medicine is that? We don't have anything else that comes close. Nothing else comes close. In an LSD study with addiction, with alcohol addiction, one of the big findings, a very curious finding, was it was the extent to which people had a mystical experience that determined their success with their alcohol addiction. Catch that. The extent to which they had a mystical experience, a sense of being integrated with and united with and at one with all things, and in place, in balance with that, in a harmonious, happy way. That was the determining factor. It wasn't, a big difference between 125 micrograms and 200 micrograms. No. It had to do with the extent to which they had a mystic experience. Now, this flies in the face of two big institutions, organized religions and medicine. You can, in fact, keep people hopelessly addicted to anti-anxiety drugs, to antidepressants, to various drugs that in other ways dope you out, make you less sensitive, and also imperil your health. I mean, I think it's a real ripoff that people take antidepressants that make them depressed. I think it's a ripoff that people take anti-anxiety drugs that make them more anxious. And I think that death is an unacceptable adverse drug reaction. That's just where I draw the line. Now, as we know, nobody in history has ever died from cannabis, and yet there are grave, grave concerns about the safety of cannabis. And nobody's ever really articulated what those grave concerns are, because nobody's ever died from this. Whereas 30,000 people in the US die every year from ibuprofen, about the same number from acetaminophen, a couple 100,000 people die every single year from the proper use of over-the-counter and prescription drugs, and those just go merrily on. And yet we have a category here, not because we're adversarial, but just because it's the fact of the matter that threatens all of that. We brought a friend down to the Amazon about 6 years ago, and he'd been addicted to antidepressants for 30 years. And he'd suffered greatly. Brilliant musician, wonderful guy, had very, very rugged personal experiences. He drank ayahuasca. He went through absolute hell. Absolute hell. It was very, very difficult. And when he came out of that experience, he was not addicted to antidepressants anymore, and he was not depressed anymore. And he's had his minor bouts of depression since, but not with that addiction. And he's much more prolific as a musician and much more creative and much happier and more engaged and a better husband and all of that. There's no wrong there. And that's one of the reasons that we keep going forward with this, because of the intrinsic rightness of this whole category, because we discover something that so completely breaks us out of the boundaries of social convention in all of the ways that we're limited by that, that we find ourselves dwelling in a better place, and this is appealing. When I first went back home from drinking ayahuasca my first time to deal with the grief of my mother's death, I had grieved entirely too long, like 14 months. I was sitting at Thanksgiving dinner with my family, and my uncle likes to go around the table and say, "And what did you do this year? How was your year?" You know, they got to me and I said, "Well, I just got back from the Amazon rainforest where I was with native shamans drinking this hallucinogenic brew to get over the grief of mom's death." And this is sort of like, oh, good. Well, and, and the conversation sort of went from there. But the great part about it was that everybody recognized that I was doing better. And however weird it was that I was telling them about this thing that they don't understand at all, they got the effect. Which brings me to a Zen saying, look to the obvious. Whatever it is that people go through, so many times they get healed, and isn't that the point of medicine? If somehow you wind up riding on the trunk of a mastodon through a bank whose jewels and riches are hamburgers, however weird that is, if at the end of it you're relieved of some terrible, terrible burden that has dogged you your whole life, who cares what the vision was? Seriously, who cares? You know, there are 3 different kinds of visions, I think, just like the Tibetans describe 3 different types of dreams. There's the head salad. You have to know the head salad when you encounter it. I have these tomato can guys who show up. They're robots with these humongous tomato can heads. I know they're meaningless. I've had them for years. They just appear out of nowhere, and sometimes they open up a little space in their head and go, "Want to come in?" It's like, no, man. I seriously do not want to get into your tomato can head. Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Then There are the strings that we pull that have to do with, whoa, you know, I remember that incident when such and such happened, and I never realized that I've always carried that burden of whatever it is. And those are good teaching visions. And they help us to resolve things in our psyches. And then, of course, people have the just flat-out beatific mystical experiences. I was on this show, and some of you have heard me say this from last year. I was on this show called The Preachers in Los Angeles. 4 American, Black, Southern, Baptist, evangelical ministers, and me on a segment called Ayahuasca, the God Drug. It was great. It was just great, you know. Because they tried so hard to be open-minded. It was delightful. I mean, they really went all out, but they just like couldn't get past a certain point. And they really lost it when I said, well, I had this experience in which, you know, there I was in ayahuasca ceremony, and I wound up dwelling in the light of the compassionate heart of Christ for hours. It was just too far to go. And one guy said, I only want to meet my maker when I die. I said, okay, all right, you know, you don't want to do that now. And they were like all pretty much in agreement. We don't want to do that now. And I didn't mean the death. I meant, you know, why wait? Why wait for your spiritual visions? Why wait for your healings? Who sold this crazy, cockamamie, ridiculous, absurd idea that if you really, really, really suffer now, you're going to have a great time later? Like, what person came back and said, no, it's really true. Flagellate yourself now. It's fabulous there once you do that. Nobody. Nobody came back to say that. Nobody. Why do we believe this nonsense? Why is the fear so early put into people's minds and into their hearts? That's the awful thing. It's not the mind sickness that's so bad. It's the heart sickness. It's the separation that gets created by isms, ologies, and osophies that oppress people. That's the part that hurts the most. And when we have the mystic experience in the psychedelic landscape, something else happens. We are connected to all things, at all people, in all times. A 1956 video, I wish they'd given the woman's name, but it's just A Housewife Takes LSD. Okay, so you can find this on YouTube, and this woman is stunning. She's articulate, she's beautiful, she's clear-minded, she's intelligent, and she's given LSD. And there's the narrator, so how are you feeling now? And so he's just playing kind of like the Walter Cronkite, you know, role, and she's saying, can't you see it? It's beautiful. And she's trying to ask her all these rational questions like, well, do you favor or not favor this? And she's, favor or not favor? I'm at one with everything in the universe. And it goes on like that. And you can tell there's this real disparity between what he understands and what she's going through. And her exposition of the experience is as good as anybody's ever. It's marvelous. And this is what we can get. And when we have this experience, it leaves an indelible stamp on our psyches. And it leaves an indelible stamp on our hearts. And that starts to change things. You know, I recognized very, very early, I mean, not that anybody in this room would probably be surprised, but I wasn't cut out for office work. That's why I was like, very early on, I was, no, I'll just drive to Tijuana and truck fruit up. I'm good for that. Okay, so I did that for a while, and I did massage for a while, and I taught yoga for a long, long, long time, and have worked in the natural products scene where people are forgiving and they're doing psychedelics on weekends anyway. And that was where I fit in. You sort of find your tribe, or you make your tribe. We are facing a time when our activity with psychedelics is really making a difference. I don't mean it's making a difference in the socio-political landscape to the extent that people are dropping their nukes. They're not doing that. There's lots of saber rattling all over the world. There are people oppressing each other everywhere. I'm not one of those people who says, oh, wow, man, it's so great. Everybody's getting so high. It's just not true. The facts say otherwise. But still, there is this growing, expanding community of people. And it is a community. We come together and it's like, what do people do here? They hug. It's great. You meet somebody, you hug. And rather than, hi, I'm Chris. The way it happens at a lot of business meetings. I have spoken at cosmetic ingredient conferences because I find cosmetic ingredients in the Amazon rainforest and other places that then wind up in jars of expensive goo. And this goo gets sold at places like Sephora and the department stores, and people buy these jars of goo and they put them on themselves. So I will speak to these groups of cosmetic chemists. And I have, at almost every time when I've talked about Amazonian ingredients, I've said, now I'm going to tell you about something you've not heard about, you're certainly not going to do anything about, and you're not going to put into your products. And they all look, and I tell them about ayahuasca. And I really tell them about ayahuasca. And you see them all kind of sit up like, wait a like if they could, they'd reach for the remote control. But after, when people come up to me and comment, they never comment about, hey, thanks for sharing that information about the oil from the fruit of Mauritia flexuosa. They never do that. 201, they come up and they say, thank you for talking about that thing that you talked about at the end. Because there's something that pricks the imagination. We know there's more. We know there's more. We know that what we experience and what we've been taught, without going into lavish conspiracy theories, is a very, very, very tiny bit of what's really possible. This particular shaman, well over 10 years ago, this man named Don Lucio showed up at an ayahuasca center where I was doing ceremonies. My friend Andy was there. And Don Lucio was this character. He first of all, he looked like Mick Jagger, which is kind of weird. And he wore tux tails, which was very strange. He'd walk around in these tuxedo tails in the middle of the day. And he always had a towel over his shoulder. Okay, weird all around. And he was a friendly enough guy, but you could also tell that at some point in time, he had made the decision to make his home in the spirit landscape, and that he was a visitor here. And in ceremony, he had this uncanny capacity to do something that I really haven't experienced in the same way with any other shaman. He could just open this yawning, gaping chasm of pure, raw power and say, hey, come on in and play. And I had some of the most difficult healing I ever had in my entire experience of close to 11 years of drinking ayahuasca in ceremony with Don Lucio. And I experienced more power and more raw juice and more direct access to the spirit world with this man than pretty much in any ceremony ever. The healing, just nasty, gnarly, deeply awful, disturbing things from my past and in my psyche, cleansed and healed and resolved. And at the same time, this majestic expanse of energy and spirits, and literally seeing the wheels of time and having one entity after another come to visit, and snakes that cleaned out dark matter inside me. And at one point, I rose up in the air and did a dive, like a Greg Louganis-style dive, right down into the open throat of a gigantic anaconda. Disorienting, for sure. And then later on, I was like this. And the anaconda came down in me. Back at you, buddy. So whatever that meant, the effect was that I was resolved of many of the things that disturbed me the most in my life. He was a great man. Never saw him again, couldn't find him later. It was like he came, he participated in ceremony, he did these spectacular things, and then he was gone. Never found the guy again. Asked about him for years and years. Could never locate Don Lucio. I don't know what happened to him. As we engage ourselves with each other here and with conversations about the medicine, it's useful and valuable to keep in mind a few things. One is that these are truly transformative tools. It's okay to do mushrooms and play naked frisbee on the beach. That's cool, as long as it's a nude beach. Be careful. I believe I can fly. No, you can't. But, it's also wonderful to have these as agents of spiritual revelation for the direct experience of spirit. You do not need an intermediary. Oh, some people who can help along the journey, shamans who can sing you in and out, sure, fine. But you can have these encounters of spirit for yourself. You can have these experiences of healing for yourself. You can have these experiences of integration and coming to a place of inspiration and understanding and appreciation and gratitude and compassion and love for others that enable you to go forward engaging in a way that's more whole, more sweet, more life-imbuing, and just happier overall. And if that isn't a good reason to engage with psychedelics, I just don't know what is. Thank you so much.